Novice qualitative researchers often encounter a very confusing cloud of terminologies. The problem with these terminologies is that they are not self-explanatory, and they are rarely explained in detail when you read journal articles. To add to that, there are many different schools or philosophies of qualitative research. Each school has its own set of beliefs and convictions. Well, we need to understand that these terminologies and these philosophies were birthed as researchers wrestled with ensuring that qualitative research should be conducted in a robust and scientific manner. So these processes and philosophies make qualitative research distinct from other fields that also use words, also use descriptions. For example, journalism or creative writing. So when it comes to us doing qualitative research, what are the components, the key components in qualitative research? So in the last section, in this following section, we will look at three things. The first would be qualitative research designs and how to choose an appropriate one. The second would be qualitative research process, and the third one would be qualitative methods. In quantitative studies, research design relates to the overall plan of the study. So examples include cross-sectional designs, case control, or experimental study designs, trials, so on and so forth. What about qualitative research? In this section, I'm going to show you 5 of the most common designs that are used in qualitative health research. These would be ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, action research, and lastly, the case study. Before we go into these study designs, as I introduce each one, you may want to think of these designs as different schools or tribes of qualitative research. Now, each school has its own philosophy, its own history, and its own ways of collecting and analyzing qualitative data. Unlike quantitative designs or quantitative studies, where you can easily diagram the study and it follows logical flows, qualitative designs are often more flexible, and the emphasis is more on the philosophy of knowledge, which we call epistemology. So it's not so easy to show a step-by-step diagram of qualitative designs.
Why is this so? It's because qualitative data is fluid, the data is exploratory, therefore much flexibility is actually required. Also, qualitative data requires subjective interpretation as it deals with words and meanings. Therefore, it is important for researchers to be clear about how they want to interpret the data.
Ethnography is a qualitative design that originated from anthropology. It comes from the word ethno, which means people, and graph, which means writing. Data in ethnography is collected through a method called participant observation. What does that mean? It means that the researcher who becomes a participant, the researcher enters into the whole life of the study participants. The researcher in ethnography may observe them as they stay with them, as they follow them up over extended periods of time, and be present at significant life events such as family gatherings, weddings, and even funerals. The researcher is interested in examining and describing the culture, the patterns of behavior, the customs, or the way of life of this group of interest. Now, the classic example of an ethnographic study would be research on indigenous tribes of people. But of course, the ethnographic approach, this participant observation, can be used to study any population of interest. The second qualitative design is phenomenology. This comes from the Greek words phenomenon, meaning that which appears, and logos, which means study. Phenomenology originated as a philosophical view in Germany, where philosophers were interested in the subjective meaning of life, as opposed to the philosophy that life was all about objects interacting in logical and systematic ways with each other. This phenomenological approach, was later applied in social research in fields such as psychology, sociology, and social work. Phenomenological researchers are interested in understanding how does the world appear to others. Personal perspectives and interpretations of events or topics are of interest to phenomenologists. Thus, one key concept that we should understand when we look at phenomenology is that of the participant's lived experience. This means that as people experience something, as they go through an event in life, they develop a very unique self-awareness or a perception of that phenomenon or concept. Now, for example, everyone going through an illness will experience it differently, even if their prognostic results are exactly the same or very similar to other people. So just to recap, to summarize, ethnography is interested in whole groups, while phenomenology is mostly interested in individual experiences. The third type of research design is grounded theory. Grounded theory was developed by Glaser and Strauss, two sociologists working in the 1960s. The name grounded theory comes from the purpose of the design, which is to design a theory about an area of interest based as closely as possible to the real world, meaning to say that this theory has to be grounded in the data. To develop a theory from scratch, a complex and very iterative process is required. Thus, grounded theory starts with one, or maybe just a few, generative questions which aim to kickstart the exploratory process. From these questions and subsequent data that the researcher collects, a theory is developed as patterns of meaning, as patterns of behavior emerge. This process is very iterative. This means that questions and even sampling is modified as the theory develops or as the theory emerges. In grounded theory, it's very important for researchers to set aside their theoretical ideas or their preconceived notions about the topic of interest. Why is this so? It is important because the theory that emerges has to be based on observation and not on the researcher's preconceived ideas. Now, given that grounded theory aims to create a very robust and very substantive theory, grounded theory researchers would use a lot of verification procedures. They would use what is called the constant comparison method, which is a way of helping them to consciously and constantly compare incoming new data with existing old data, and to see if the data changes the emerging theory in any way. So during the process of data analysis, there is a prescribed way or recommended way in grounded theory of how people are supposed to code or categorize this data. They use a system of open, axial, and selective coding, meaning to say that the coding progresses from very, very small categories into larger, more general categories to build a theory. Lastly, the sampling of participants is known as theoretical sampling. This means that participants are purposefully selected according to how the data emerges. For example, when you choose future participants, you can choose them to either confirm or even disprove a particular aspect or particular category in the emerging theory. One example of grounded theory is the work by Kathy Chalmers on developing a theory of how patients with chronic illness choose to disclose their illness to others. Action research was first developed in the 1940s. In action research, the researcher wants to balance two things. They want to understand a problem or issue. They want to be a researcher who researches this thing. And on the other hand, they want to use what they have learned to provide a solution to this problem or issue. So action research is usually undertaken by an individual who is either an active member or has a collaborative relationship with the organization or the group or the population facing the problem or issue. Based on the research that they conduct, they are able then to suggest improvements to the system, to suggest guidelines for best practice to improve that area of interest. Now, this type of action research is often called practical action research or participatory action research, and it's used in companies or organizations that want to improve their organizational culture, they want to improve their organizational practice. Now, participatory action research is a type of action research that is based on an ethical philosophy that a researcher does not have to be a very passive, a step back, a very disinterested almost type of researcher whose research has to be objective and repeatable. Rather, it gives opportunity to the researcher to be a person who, firstly, participates in the situation, in the lives of their participants. Secondly, takes concrete action to improve these lives. And of course, lastly, produces good, robust research. We are going to talk about qualitative case studies. Qualitative case studies are an intensive study of a specific individual or a specific context. Now, very similar to ethnographic studies, which focus on describing a culture or a group in very rich detail. A qualitative case study seeks to form a very rich biography of an individual of interest. So case studies in qualitative research may include perhaps up to 4 cases. Any more than 4 cases would dilute the analysis, as there would be a lack of depth in any single individual case. Of course, given the highly specific nature of case studies, the results of a case study would definitely be bound by the time and the place of observation. So readers, people who read your study, would need to have as much of this information as possible in order to understand the context of a case study. By now, you would have a rough idea of the different types of qualitative research designs. You can probably notice a range between, on one hand, some look at groups versus, on the other hand, some look at individuals, describing what we see, right, versus exploring what people would perceive and not changing the situation at all. And some qualitative designs would aim to make changes in the environment that is being researched. So how do you choose an appropriate research design? The following diagram helps us to see when each type of design is appropriate. Now, if an event or a situation gives rise to an experience, this would give rise to an account or a description of the experience. Now, this account is what qualitative research seeks to explore and is reported as the results of your research. So, the methodology which you choose depends on what type of account is wanted. If you are keen to paint a portrait, if you want to describe what is going on through observation, a portrait of culture requires an ethnographic study, while an individual portrait requires a case study. On the other hand, if you are interested in people's subjective experience, you would probably use a phenomenological approach to describe or understand this experience. If you want to explore the relationship between the situation or the context and the experience, you would probably aim to use a grounded theory if you are seeking to build a theory or model of that relationship. However, if you want to take action in that situation, then you would probably use action research or evaluative research to evaluate the success of the actions that you have taken. There are many methods of collecting qualitative data. The researcher may choose to collect data through observation. Using their powers of observation, they take detailed field notes, or they capture pictures or recordings of the research topic. Another source of data could be documents or archival records, historical records, newspaper and media reports, patient histories may all serve as sources of qualitative data. Thirdly, a researcher may also collect data using focus group discussions. These are groups comprising about 4 to 8 participants and discussion on a very defined or decided research topic being facilitated by the researcher. Lastly, in-depth interviews may be used to collect data. These are one-to-one interviews with a participant based on a topic guide or interview guide which has been developed beforehand to explore the research topic of interest.